Welcome everybody to this first webinar that the provinces are providing for deputies, bishops, anyone that's interested in General Convention and the issues that are going to come before General Convention. My name is Ellen Bruckner, and on behalf of the 9 provinces of the Episcopal Church, I am welcoming you. Let us pray. Just and merciful God, you speak through the prophets, challenging us to seek peace rooted in justice. Help us to hear your urgent call. Loving God, in Jesus, you change our lives for good, challenging us to work for reconciliation. Help us to use your way of truth and love. With us, God, your Holy Spirit moves us to action, challenging us to live the good news. Help us to respond wholeheartedly here and now, to say yes. Amen.
Amen.
Like I said, these webinars are sponsored by the Provincial Leadership Conference, which is the presidents, vice presidents, and coordinators of all the provinces. You should know that this is being recorded and will be available to anyone that registered. You'll be getting a link after it's posted so you can go to the recording afterwards. The purpose of the webinars is to offer information and thoughts, especially in the areas of becoming beloved community. And this is, our audience is for the deputies and bishops and anyone interested in General Convention, like I said. This webinar is the first of 4, this one will focus on reconciliation as we move towards becoming beloved community. We're also including anti-gun violence and prison reform in this webinar. So we're grateful for the questions that came in ahead of time, and we'll be able to ask some of those. And then people can start putting questions in the chat. I'm sure that we will not get time for all questions, and we're going to put all the questions afterwards on the Facebook event page, Preparing for General Convention. I'd like to introduce our presenters tonight. Mr. James McKim is Chief of Staff for the Technical Training Division of Hewlett Packard Enterprises. He's the chair of the Episcopal Church Executive Council Committee on Anti-Racism. And he serves on the Episcopal Church of New Hampshire Commission on Ministry, the Reconciliation Commission, and is the Episcopal Church of New Hampshire representative to the Province 1 Multicultural Awareness and Cultural Competency Task Force. He also serves on several nonprofit boards, including the Black Data Processing Association and New Hampshire Public Broadcasting. So welcome, James. We're glad you're with us.
Thank you. Good to be here.
The Very Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas is Dean of the Episcopal Divinity School at Union Theological Seminary and Professor of Theology at Union. She also serves as the canon theologian at the Washington National Cathedral. She was ordained as an Episcopal priest in 1983 and holds a master's degree in theology and a PhD in systematic theology from Union. She's the author of many articles and 5 books and has co-authored a position paper currently posted on Union's website titled NRA, Our Children Are Not Sacrificial Lambs. Welcome, Kelly.
Thank you.
Glad you're here. The Reverend Dr. Walter Van Zant Windsor has served the Diocese of Mississippi, the Central Gulf Coast, and Arkansas. And while in Mississippi, Van was the startup chaplain for the Wilkinson County Correctional Facility, which is a privately run state hospital, or state prison, excuse me. The focus of his doctoral project at EDS was establishing and maintaining an anti-racism prison ministry in Mississippi. In Arkansas, he was a member of the Diocesan Prison Ministry Committee and was a founding member of the Dick Johnston Children's Camp, which is a camp for the children of incarcerated. In 2017, Van began a new chapter in prison work at Louisiana State Penitentiary, also called Angola, where he's a social services counselor, working full-time in the mental health department. And you should know that Angola is the largest maximum security prison in the U.S. So welcome, Van. We're also glad you're here.
Well, I'm humbled and pleased to be here.
So we begin with 4 broad questions for our panelists. These questions are, from your experience in this area of reconciliation, what church-wide resolutions or responses need to be brought before General Convention? And then how do these resolutions help shift us to be more towards becoming beloved community? How are these focus issues and resolutions affected by the current draft of the 2019-2021 budget? And then what topics need additional dialogue prior to General Convention? I know that many resolutions are not posted yet. Some have been posted, some were in the Blue Book, and so those reports are coming online as they're formatted. So there may not be resolutions in these particular areas posted as of yet. So I've asked the panelists to share for about 15 minutes each in this area, and then we'll have some questions and answers. So James, I'd like to begin with you, please.
Alrighty. So can you see my screen?
Yep.
Excellent. So thank you for the opportunity to share a little bit about what the Executive Council Committee on Anti-Racism is doing around General Convention resolutions. I'm just going to spend a few minutes to address those 4 questions which Ellen just posed, and I'm going to do so in the flow that you see on the right-hand side of the screen. And I'm going to start with what ECCAR is. ECCAR is the acronym for the Executive Council Committee on Anti-Racism. And I'll talk about the resolutions that we're putting forth. I'll embellish a couple of them with some more detail around a certification framework we've offered up. And then I'll talk to the question about becoming beloved community and how the resolutions help shift us toward becoming beloved community. And then I'll answer the question about budget and additional dialogue that I and the committee sees that we need to have, and then wrap it up. That's where I'm headed in the next few minutes. So first of all, a little bit about ECCAR. ECCAR was created as the Anti-Racism Commission of the Church at General Convention in 1988 with Resolution A092. And the charge that the commission was given was to guide and monitor the church's work in response to General Convention resolutions directed at eliminating the sin of racism from the life of the church. And they identified a number of ways that they saw that this commission could work, and it's really as an advisory and guidance organization for the officers of the church. And I'm not going to read everything here, but you can see that it's around things like developing a framework and making sure that racism, anti-racism work is seen as a fundamental part of Christian formation. We're supposed to be monitoring and evaluating ministries and programming toward eliminating the sin of racism, recommending best practices, collecting data on provincial activities, and developing criteria for credentialing trainers in doing training around anti-racism work, whatever the venue for that training might be, and following up on how the church is really doing around fulfilling the legislation passed by General Convention around eliminating the sin of anti-racism. So that's the context in which ECCAR operates. And we do operate very closely with staff. So the resolutions that we have put together are developed by our commission, which has representatives from each of the provinces. And so the resolutions that I'm listing here are from our commission, as well as there's one resolution that I'm aware of that is put forth by the Task Force on Clergy Formation in Small Congregations. So these resolutions are, as you can see, first of all, as you've seen with the Becoming Beloved Community effort, there's a shift from focusing on anti-racism, I should say a shift, not a shift necessarily, but a recognition that doing anti-racism work is not sufficient to achieving becoming beloved community. And so racial reconciliation, which our presiding bishop and the presiding officers are really pushing us toward, is something we as the commission want to recognize and make sure that the commission is, from a legislative perspective in the church, also able to say, yes, we want to support that as a church and we want to move in that direction of reconciliation, not just doing anti-racism work. So our feeling is we need the name of the commission to change to include reconciliation as well. So the first resolution is about that name change, and it's symbolic, but symbols, as we know, are very important. The second resolution is around clarifying and updating the mandate, which I just showed you, which you saw has anti-racism strewn all throughout it. We want to update that to include racial reconciliation in that mandate. The third resolution is around establishing an anti-racism and racial reconciliation certification framework. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this one in the next session, in the next slide. So I won't say too much about that here. Safe to say here that we recognize that the church has had as part of canon that those going through ordination and those who are in leadership positions, that they should have taken anti-racism training. What we found, though, in practice is that A, not everyone does, in fact, take it, and we have no way of knowing. B, what does it mean when we say to take anti-racism training? You know, there's for those who are going through the ordination process, there's a checkbox that has to be checked off that says you've taken anti-racism training. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean you've attended a 1-hour session that describes anti-racism? Does that really equip you to do this work that is so sorely needed and that the church wants us to do? We think not. So we wanted to put some more meat on the bone, so to speak, into what that really means and define that from a church overall policy perspective. The fourth resolution is around having a general convention, the legislative body, acknowledge that fact that we are, as a church, not really following the canons and not really following the resolutions that have been developed around requirements for anti-racism training. And we're having general convention as a legislative body affirm the framework that we are proposing, that we ECCAR are proposing, that I'm about to share with you in the next slide. The fifth resolution, the last resolution that we are putting forward, is hosting a racial reconciliation awards program. And our idea behind this is we want to celebrate the people who do this work of racial reconciliation. It is difficult, hard work. But if we can hold up people as examples, both individuals and organizations, as examples of doing this work and doing it well, we think that's important to do to help everyone else who's trying to do this work to see what can be done and what should be done. So that's our fifth resolution. And the resolution that's coming from the Task Force on Clergy Formation in Small Congregations is around policies and best practice sharing in ways to make sure that small congregations can have culturally diverse clergy, can encourage participation and inclusion of culturally diverse clergy in those small congregations. So those are the resolutions overall. Let me take a few minutes to talk about the certification framework that we're putting forth in a policy paper, which is now available. I can give it to you. We're going to post it on the racial reconciliation page of the website as well. So we're talking about a framework that includes training standards, which we're defining, a certification rubric, and a certification process. So for the training standards, we've identified that there need to be 3 components of any training around anti-racism. And those components are historical, where we make sure that people are trained on the history of racism in the church and what General Convention resolutions and what canons say are our commitments around the work of anti-racism. Also, didactic or informational components. We want people to understand what the various terms are. We've defined 34 terms that are used in this work of racial reconciliation. We want everyone to be on the same page with what those terms are and how they are to be used. And the third component is activities. We know that it's one thing to intellectually know what terms mean. It's something totally different to be able to put that knowledge into action. So we believe it's very important to allow in this training safe space, brave space, as Reverend Timothy Seaman says, a place to practice using this knowledge. And sometimes it's new knowledge that folks have learned. So wrapping that along with adult education best practices, training needs to have learning objectives identified up front, presented to the learners so they can agree on them and buy into them and have their mindset ready to achieve those as they go through the training. And also respectful communications guidelines. Those need to be set up front at the beginning of every training, and everyone needs to buy into those. So that's the training standards that we've put together. So with that, we're saying there needs to be a rubric. And that rubric identifies what level in our learning model everyone needs to be at to do certain work around racial reconciliation in the church. So at the very base awareness level, we're saying that's for people who just want to improve themselves. And that training can take anywhere from 2 hours to a 1-day training program. But that's different than a competency level of training where people are going to be advocating for racial reconciliation. They're going to really be doing this work at an organizational level, not just a personal level. And that training to train to get to that level takes at least a 1-day or 2-day training program for someone who's not been doing this work before. The third and highest level we look at is a mastery level. And this is for people who are going to be teaching others and creating programs around anti-racism and racial reconciliation. It's a different level of knowledge and capabilities than someone who's just aware of what anti-racism is. So with that rubric, we're saying, so how do we make sure people are going through this process and are achieving the levels that we expect them to have, particularly the competency level, which we want by canon, those going through ordination, and by a General Convention resolution, lay leaders to be at. And this is something that we're proposing as part of our resolution. We want people going through ordination and lay leaders to not just be at the awareness level, but they need to be at the competency level because they're doing the work of advocating for racial reconciliation. And then the teachers need to be at the mastery level. So our process is for both teachers and for individuals. And I've already been working with the IT director at the National Church, and we have a plan for building a testing mechanism online. so that individuals and trainers will go through this testing mechanism once they've gone through whatever training that they think is best, and whatever the training the diocese or the province can put together. As long as they pass our tests at whichever of these levels they're taking the tests for, we will certify them as having taken anti-racism and racial reconciliation training and achieving the levels of competency or mastery that we think is necessary to do the work of racial reconciliation. Those records of both the trainers and those who have gone through the training at various levels will be maintained on the church's systems, and at the provincial and diocesan levels, folks will have access to the list of trainers so they can decide who they want to use to put forth training to meet the canons and the General Convention resolution. So those things together make up this framework that we're proposing through our resolutions. So let me talk now a little bit about becoming beloved community.
I'm going to give you about 2 minutes, James.
Good, thank you. Good, great. I'm wrapping up.
Okay.
So with these resolutions, we're looking to expand the church oversight of what is being done for anti-racism to being around racial reconciliation as well. We're equipping everyone with a common context of the Episcopal Church vocabulary to engage in the work around, and doing that through training standards for those who develop and deliver. We're re-emphasizing the importance through our resolution to recognize the importance of this work and establishing resources for small congregations to bring in diverse clergy, and sharing examples of the work through the recognition program. In terms of budget, we've tried to make it so that the budget is not really heavily impacted by the policies that we put forth, but funding for ECCAR itself as an entity needs to go forth. And we're not quite sure how that's going to work, given the fact that a lot of the racial reconciliation funding has gone to staff rather than elsewhere. The provincial structure has lately been a question. Our province is going to continue to exist. So that if not, that changes how ECCAR operates, and we'll need to be concerned with that. And then the beloved community funding, becoming beloved community funding, seems to be at the national level. What's the trickle down? Where does the funding go to the provinces and to the local dioceses for programs that they may need to put into play? So with that, I'm actually done. And so I will pass it back to Ellen.
Thank you, James, very much. Thank you. I'm sure some questions came in the chat, and if you want to take a look at those while Van is speaking, then that may be helpful later. Okay? Can you see? You can see the chat, can't you?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Van, we're to you.
Well, thank you. I really appreciated what James had to say, and I think it kind of dovetails into what I would like to talk about related to prison ministry. And I think reaching out to the community. I love the notion of the beloved community, and what community has been pushed away from the whole community more than those who are in prison. They are separated, and they are meant separated. And so we try to make inroads into talking with them and helping their lives to be better. But in reality, we still are stockpiling people. We still are keeping a large segment of our society in gated communities, if you will. And it's unfortunate. I would like to see that we would look at the prison community as part of our overall community, that we would see them not just in terms of those people incarcerated, but that we would also look at the people that are affected by their incarceration, their children, their husbands or wives, the victims, and also the people that work in the prisons. So often those people are people that are seen as obstacles. They're just there to be the gatekeepers. And that is where so much of our work really needs to be done. We need to bring those sorts of anti-racism programs to enlighten and inform that particular profession. Also, I would say that we need to look seriously at mental health in this country. We tend to incarcerate a number of people who are mentally ill, and they will not benefit, nor will society benefit, nor will the prison community benefit from their being in prisons. They need to be taken care of. They need to be helped and included in that overall beloved community as people who we can reach out to and help. I would think that the idea of education, as James mentioned, is very important. And we need to help to incorporate education in the lives of the people in prisons, but also the people that work in the prisons, so that system can be opened up, and that it would not necessarily be a system that is at odds with each other, but rather one that is there to take care of and to, if you will, to help correct behavior and to enable people to grow out of the situation that brought them into those prisons. I think we need to realize how important those positions are. You know, one of the things that I noticed with the camp for the children of the incarcerated was that oftentimes several people in a family may be incarcerated. And so those children have been growing up in foster homes, or they've been growing up in situations that are detrimental to their growth and their ability to become the people that we would hope they could become. And given that class plays such an important part in prison work, because of course there are several classes of people and the way in which we separate ourselves in society, and it isn't just racism alone, but it's also the differences, the wealth, and the lack of opportunity that people have. And so with that opportunity in a camp, a children's camp, you can have a direct effect on the lives of those young people. I was amazed. He was a social worker that really did so much work in that camp. It was a Christian camp, but yet an Episcopal camp. But that social worker was able to deal with the real issues related to life. And I have found that true at Louisiana State Penitentiary. The social workers and the healthcare workers are phenomenal people, very dedicated, and they deal with the real life issues that affect those inmates. They are able to understand, they are able to take and to better their lives, even those people who are mentally ill and in a situation that does not encourage them to grow. They are able to really help and have a profound effect. And I would like to see the Episcopal Church establish prison ministry as not just a way to go in and do services, or not just a way to look for people who might be willing to participate with us, but rather look at a one-to-one relationship with individuals that would allow those people imprisoned to understand that they too, as the presiding bishop would say, share the face of Jesus, and that they too have that image of God within them. And so I hope that a program like James could be used, James has mentioned, could be used in a prison setting, not necessarily by the church, but perhaps the church could bring about ways in which they could be established for state prisons or private prisons, and different ways in which the prison themselves or people from outside the prison with the state could bring about a profound effect on the lives of those people.
All right. Thank you very much, Van. I appreciate the comments. Thank you. Kelly, are you ready to go? You're muted.
Now I'm unmuted.
Now you're unmuted.
Yes, and thank you. And first of all, let me begin again by saying that it's a privilege to be with you all this evening, and with James and Van, and to hear about these important issues and perhaps ways in which the Episcopal Church can address these issues. I was invited to speak this evening about an issue that is of particular concern to me, and about which I am passionate. After the massacre at Marjorie Stone Douglas High School, many have suggested, particularly in her words, Senator Feinstein suggested that we had reached a tipping point in this nation. In fact, we have reached a tipping point in this country, but that tipping point is about more than guns. That tipping point is about violence. In that regard, there is more at stake for us in our country as a people than simply gun rights, more at stake than the quote unquote Second Amendment. At stake for us, I believe, is our very humanity. And that brings us to the beloved community and to the Episcopal Church, if indeed it wants to live into what it means to be church. I want to speak just a few minutes about that, and hopefully to provoke conversation and the, should I say, faith imagination to find ways in which we can address this issue within our church, on the convention floor, perhaps through resolutions that end up not simply in a blue book or somewhere else, but resolutions that inspire us to live into what it means to be church, which is nothing less than what it means to lead the way in becoming what we are calling the beloved community. So I'll say a few things about that. The beloved community, it seems to me, of the many things in which we may say that it is about. It is about respecting the sacred dignity and life of every human being that would be a child of God. That means respecting the sacred dignity and life of every single human being on God's earth. As far as I know, everyone who has breath and has ever had breath, in that the breath we breathe comes from God, is a child of God and is sacred, period, regardless. To build a beloved community is to build a community which in fact respects and affirms that very fact that we are all children of God. Violence is anything that would demean, that would disrespect, that would deny the sacred life and dignity of any human being. In this regard, it seems to me that violence is to be against that which God is for. And that means to oppose God's very sacred creation in any way. That's violent. That's sinful, in that it separates us from God and God's creation. In this regard, when we think about violence, We have to think beyond the discrete, physical, sporadic, even violence that we see that finds its way on our television screens, that the violence we see that breaks out into, that has become a part of our city landscapes, our nation's landscape, the violence that we see that manifests itself in things like the massacre that occurred at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School. When we see that violence, that is the violence that violence created. When we speak of guns and gun violence, that is symptomatic of a violent culture that this country has nurtured and has fostered. Such a culture is manifest in something like the culture that is the culture of poverty. Poverty is violent. Poverty creates circumstances of death. I say that poverty is about a culture of death. Violence is about a culture of death. It is about that which denies in any way, dehumanizes, etc., the life, sacred life of God's creation, of God's creatures. When we think of the culture of poverty, that is the lack of health care, the lack of decent housing, the lack of decent education, the lack of opportunities, the lack of recreational opportunities. We are talking about a violent culture of death. And so it should be no surprise to us when we see these cultures indeed fulfilling their very purpose. That is, creating situations where you have homicidal deaths, where you have the proliferation of gun violence. That's what they do. That's the intent. So by the time we see guns entering into this culture of death, well, the culture is one, it's done what it's supposed to do. That's what it's promoting. Guns are about the violence that violence has created. Racism, it's violent. Sexism, homophobia, transphobia, they're violent. Anything that denies, again, whether it's system structures or ideologies or policies, are violent. What are the policies that we hold on to that are policies that are really emerged out of violent cultures of death, like our gun policies? So now, what ought to be our response as a church? One, I often like to say in shorthand, well, our response as an Episcopal church should be to be church. And we aren't always that. And to be church means in so many respects to promote, yes, the beloved community, which means in every way possible, we are to promote and to hold as sacred the very life, the very things that God holds as sacred, the sacred dignity of and life of every human being. In fact, we're about a religion that, we're a resurrection people, a people that stands for the sacredness of life. And so what that means is that the debate has to go beyond guns, though it has to involve guns. It is so interesting to me that communities of faith this should not be an issue where we stand when it comes to guns. This should not be an issue where we stand when it comes to gun control and gun violence, because at stake is our very humanity. At stake is who we claim to be as church. We have got to stand against anything that would deny the sacredness of life, and that means guns. Now, how, period. It seems to me, and I know I'm stating this strongly because I'm passionate about it, as I think that our faith compels us to be passionate about the sacred dignity of every human being in the sacred life of every human being. This is where it connects Van and Jim to the very issues of concern which you raised before. So the prison industrial complex is a betrayal of life. It's violent in all of its manifestations. Racism, violent. White supremacy, violent. It is no accident that guns have entered into this very culture of violence of which we have promoted. So it seems to me that one of the ways in which we need to address this very issue as a church is we put forth the various resolutions. And I have not seen a resolution yet. I know I've told today that the bishops at their House of Bishops meeting has spoken about the issue of guns, but I've not seen what I have seen where the Episcopal Church will stand on guns and gun violence. But it seems to me that we need to offer a resolution that's not simply about gun control, but a resolution that talks about, that says that we are anti-violent and name the violence. Because what's getting lost in this debate on guns are people in our humanity and our human values. And what we are saying when we put guns before people is that people are the problem and guns aren't. We're saying that certain people are the problem. That's what violence does. It objectifies human beings, and it says that they're a problem. That's what racism's all about. That's what the prison industrial complex is all about. And so what it seems to me, have to do as a church is we need to be clear. We need to name the violence. We need to put forth a resolution that says stop the violence, and then suggest what we mean when we say stop the violence. And that if we are serious about stopping the violence, then we have to be serious about guns. And which means that we live in a culture of violence. We live in a context in this country that has fostered and nurtured violence. And guess what? Guns don't mix them. I'll end by saying this. Some time ago, as many of us know, and it was in 1963, perhaps, that then A-Trap Brown, now Jamal Ali, said that violence is as American as cherry pie. And he didn't know then perhaps the full truth of what he spoke. Because it seems to me that inasmuch as we remain silent on issues of violence that are racism, that are mass incarceration, then that is white supremacy as a church, then we are affirming that perhaps violence is as American as cherry pie. But we're affirming something more as a church if we remain silent. And that is that we affirm and stand for the violence that is America, and that is a part of this American culture. We can't afford to do that as a faith community. We need to stand for the sacred dignity of all of God's people. So I believe that it is time for the church to loudly, firmly say and be committed to the resolution, calling people forward to stop the violence, and then to name the violence that we're speaking of, and the way in which guns are symptomatic of the very violence that is at the root of the very issues of concern that we're speaking of, and that prevent us and truly prevents us from being a beloved community. So I've said a lot, and I will end there and hopefully engage in further conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. I'm wondering, since the three of you now have heard each other, if you have questions for each other on here before we start into some general questions. Anything that that you heard from each other that you'd like to speak about?
I don't have a question as much as a one. I thank both Jim and Van very much for their comments, and I wanted to say to Van, I'm thank you for not simply your sharing but your work. And one of the things that, as you talked about, incarceration. And that it brought to mind, and I'm sure you're familiar with the work by Brian Stevenson and his book, Just Mercy. And he, of course, speaks of the very thing that you're speaking of in so many ways, and the way in which when we incarcerate whomever it is that we incarcerate, we're also, that impacts communities. And communities of people. And I know that the House of Bishops Theological Commission, of which I'm a member, has suggested that every member of the House of Bishops, all the bishops, in fact, read. A must read is Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy. And I was also wondering how, through resolution or in some way, we could suggest or strongly commend or resolve that the church, that this book, Just Mercy, become a must read for congregations.
I think a lot of work needs to be done in the congregation. And I would hope that I left out in talking about what you're talking about in the community. We talk a lot about ministry. We do forget the jails, the county jails, the city jails. And horrible things go on in those places. Talk about violence. I would think it would be very helpful if the Episcopal Church could help to influence the lives of the people in the jails, because they are the ones that ultimately will graduate to the prisons. And if we could stop that spiral through not only the education of the one you're speaking of, but also groups like Kairos or ministry teams that would be willing to go in and to engage one-on-one with those people. And they are a forgotten people, and they are incarcerated, and they're meant to be a forgotten people. And you have people in prison that really, and in jails, that really have not committed violent crimes, and should not be ripped from the community. And we've got to reach those people. We have got to reach those people.
So that actually dovetails with the question I was going to ask, and so Van, you're on point here for our questions. One of the challenges we know, and somebody actually just posted that at last General Convention we passed a resolution urging everyone to read the new Jim Crow, and we in the Episcopal Diocese of New Hampshire, Episcopal Church of New Hampshire, also had a resolution affirming that and encouraging our churches to read New Jim Crow. So maybe it's another resolution, I'm not sure, that gets put forth, but my sense here is that the entire criminal justice community needs to have this kind of training and this kind of awareness. And that would hopefully filter down to and include the folks who are incarcerated. And I think that my sense is the way to better the system is to educate the people who are part of the system as to the impact of what they're doing. So I'm just curious to hear your thoughts about how we might make that happen. And I don't know whether there's really a resolution that should come out about that, but maybe it's a resolution, maybe it's a policy paper. I'm just curious what your thoughts are being kind of in the system.
You need to know that there is still plenty of time to write resolutions, and you have a lot of deputies that are listening. And so if that's something that needs to be done, there's time to do that.
Well, I would hope that resolutions would be passed to enlighten the church as to what ways we can take and what steps we can take to better the lives of those who are incarcerated. But unless we change the culture, that's not going to happen. that is just not going to happen. I've seen very little change in prison ministry except for, in 30 years, except for perhaps there are more drugs in prisons. Nobody likes to talk about that. And there are mentally ill people in prison that do not need to be in prison. And I think it's detrimental to the safety of everyone involved. And so we've got to help people understand in our society, in our beloved community, that we have to help the mentally ill. And I mean, I know that we save money by using prisons instead, but we are not doing good for people who really need help. And so we need to look at the prison community, not just as some one kind of group, monolithic. We need to understand that they're a community made up of communities. And also there are people that desperately need contact with people who care about them as individuals, that they don't feel forgotten. And I think that takes personal contact. And so if our people are willing to pass a resolution, I think it should be, I'm going to get involved. I'm going to participate. I think that would be very helpful. I know, I know many of the bishops and many of the people in the House of Deputies do involve themselves in prison ministry.
May I add something? Yes, but I agree with that, and I like the ideal of a resolution that says I'm going to do something, as opposed to a resolution that is something we think about. I mean, we need a resolution be resolved to act. The other thing because resolutions, it's like I always say, Jesus didn't say resolve to feed the hungry, he said feed the hungry. And so that's what we need to do. The other thing when we talk about the prison industrial complex, mass incarceration, etc., that there, as important as it is, and that this isn't an either or, first, second, is the work that you're talking about that needs to be done. There is also work that needs to be done in our churches, in our congregations, that we need to do, and that is that we have to help members of our churches and in our communities see people who are incarcerated as human beings and not as prisoners. And so that we need to see something to help people to understand the way in which human beings, just like us, find themselves entrapped in this system, and then this culture of death and this culture of violence that lands many of them behind bars, and wrongly so. And so one of the things we begin to see once people are incarcerated, we call them felons, and we see them that way. And how do we help people see the humanity of these human beings that find themselves in these circumstances? It's one thing that Just Mercy helps us to do, but so I just want to say that we have to do that work just as intensely as we do the work on the inside of these systems and structures of mass incarceration.
Do you see a lot of this work being done more at the local level, or just as much at the local level as at a church-wide level? Where is this work best done?
Are you talking about prison ministry?
I'm talking about responding and changing the culture from a culture of violence to a culture of beloved community in all of the aspects that you've all talked about. So does it start at a church-wide level with these resolutions that need to speak to what we can do at a local level? Is that?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I don't want to interrupt, but I think it's both. I think that the church on this sort of national level, that the church on a national level, the church and its leadership needs to make clear that these are issues of priority, and that they need to say to congregations, to bishops in their diocese, to priests, etc. That these issues are priority issues, and that this is where how we expect our church to be church. This is the work that we expect to happen on the local levels. And so I think that unless we make it priority, and making priority is also about more than resolutions. It's about budget and money, and where does the money go? Money, it reflects our values. How we spend our money reflects our values. I'm still chagrined at the fact that we have lost the 7th canonical area that talks about social justice. How did that happen? As a priority of one of the canonical areas in which our seminarians must have competency in. So this is a reflection of our values. And so I do think it has to start at the national level in terms of naming our priorities, and it has to be acted out on the local level.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And I was going to say the work has to be done at multiple levels. It can't just be done at the national level. It can't just be done at the local level. It has to be done at both. But I think one of the things that I'm seeing is that individuals make up organizations. When you're talking national level, that's organizations. At the local level, that's individuals. And so changing the culture means changing the way that people overall think and giving them the tools and the confidence to act, where that confidence is lacking now in many people. So the church can do a great deal, and that's why we put forth the resolutions we've put forth. The church can do a great deal to teach people what they should be doing and how to do it. And making, as Kelly says, a priority of people living into their baptismal covenant and acting with love. So it's at multiple levels that we really have to act, and everything's integrated here.
I would add that one problem I think that we sometimes have is that we incarcerate ourselves within the boundaries of church. All of a sudden, the church becomes our framework, and we live beyond the church in the sense that, denominationally speaking, and we isolate ourselves. And it isn't just the Episcopal Church or the Baptist Church or the Methodist Church or the Roman Catholic Church. It's that sense that we have to allow God to work through us without becoming a church defined by our ability to be the thinking person's church, which means that anybody that doesn't think like us, can't very well function as well as we can function. And I think that makes it very difficult when we take that message that you're talking about creating to the people, not only in the pew, but beyond the pew, or in the prison, or in the community, or in the wherever, because we've already isolated ourselves. We've already created a class, and of which we're a part. And that's the only thing. And I guess I can say that because I'm not an intellectual. I understand when somebody says, this is a thinking person's church. Well, does that mean I'm stupid? So and probably some people watching are saying, well, yes, it does. But nonetheless, I think we have to be careful about the things we say about ourselves and the things that we do to ensure that they look the way we want them to look, and to reflect the things that we truly believe, which is that we can see the face of Jesus in all people.
One of the questions came in, spoke to the juvenile detention facilities and how we might, with all of these issues, might work with them. And I'm going to combine it with another question that said, we have to learn how to work with the wardens, or the wardens are in charge of these facilities. So if you take a look at the juvenile detention facilities or any kind of incarceration facilities, does the church need to learn how to work with those institutions?
That's what I meant about earlier when I was saying that we need to develop a way to communicate better with the overall community of a prison, not the culture, not just the inmates themselves. And that is absolutely true. And one of the things that about the wardens, and not just the wardens, but the officers and staff, one thing that we need to remember that we often forget is that they are not only charged with taking care of and protecting the inmates, they're also charged with taking care of the community at large and protecting the community at large. And people don't realize how often correctional employees put their life on the line. You know, this individual has gone through society and maybe done some horrible things, maybe mentally ill, maybe whatever, and very violent. That person is dealt with by the system, and then the system puts them into the correctional facility. The people who work in the correctional facility then work with that individual daily. So they are getting the brunt of prison work, and it isn't. Of course, that warden has to be concerned about the people coming in to do the programs, and the people coming in that share in the kind of reclamation of people, because they have to make sure that they're healthy people to bring in, that they're not bringing things into those people who are incarcerated, like the drugs, like the knives, like the phones, like the things that create a lot of violence in prisons, and that they're not going to be manipulated themselves. So I mean, that's a really tough position to be in. I mean, I know that, and I won't mention any names, but I know that the warden at Angola is a very fine gentleman, and really cares about the whole community. And so I think it'd be good to communicate with them. And I think if you want to get anything done, if you want to be taken seriously, there's no other way it's going to happen.
Right.
Yeah, yes, but it seems to me that this goes part and parcel when we talk about it, at least from my perspective, sort of stopping violence, that we're talking about not simply working with these persons, and we are, but we're also talking about, and I hesitate to use this word reform, because it's not about prison reform, it's about dismantling this system, this mass incarceration system that has allowed the imprisonment of human beings in such a way that they're treated like animals. And so that we've created this culture of violence within an already violent system. And so it creates the kind of dangers that you're talking about. And so how do we move from, and it seems to me the church has to lead the way in this, not only as we work with people that find themselves trapped within this prison industrial complex, whether they be those persons that are in prison or those persons working with those human beings that are in prison. But we also have to find ways to change this culture when we're talking about working with these words, et cetera, that we move from this notion of retributive justice to restorative justice.
Yes.
And because these prison systems are about retributive, vengeful kind of justice, and not about doing the kind of things that help to rehabilitate and restore people to the very humanity that has been taken away from them, given conditions that put them there in the first place. And so I think that, again, that's where churches need to lead the way. And so perhaps when we talk about resolutions, a part of that resolution, when we talk about work in prison systems, a part of that resolution has to be that we stand for restorative justice, because we recognize that the people that are within these systems are human beings, and that their very humanity is being denied, not only within those systems, but because of the denial of their humanity outside of this incarcerated system, they've ended up there in the first place. And so I think that we need to be clear about that, and so that even as we work within these systems, that the church says, this is what this is what we stand for, restorative justice, because we know that these are human beings, not prisoners.
And about the juvenile people, I think that's a horrible situation. I don't know what you can do with the system as it is now. I would be afraid to work in a juvenile institution. And the only thing that juveniles are going to learn in a juvenile institution is how to be more of a violent individual. I think it's very frightening that that our first step, oftentimes in communities that are poverty-driven or are driven by issues of racism, I think it's very frightening that the first step is to put juveniles in prison. That is not going to change anything. I know some have to be. I know that some people are very dangerous to themselves and to others, but I cannot even think what to do about the juvenile system. For those people that do ministry in that system, God bless you. And you are doing a work that is a work not many people could do.
Yep.
So Kelly, I'm going to ask you to sort of think about, or maybe it's answer this question. If we look at the church-wide level, it seems what I heard from what you were saying, that maybe the role of the church-wide level is to say how the church stands on the various issues that our culture is facing. And then we ask each diocese, each local congregation to figure out how they are going to respond and how they are going to live up to what we expect as a church.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. You know, yes, I think that I can only affirm what you said, that we have to be clear on the national level, okay, what we stand for and what we expect. And we expect that because we are church. So what we always have to do, it seems to me, is to connect this to our theology, to our faith. And so that it doesn't become, it's not about cultural wars, it's not about political wars and all political debates, it's about our faith. And so I think that when we do this on the national level, we say, this is about what it means to be church. And we have an expectation. And so how are we going to live into that? At the same time, and I think, and pick up on your earlier question and on what James said, that it's both and, that we on the local level, and that's what we're doing here in these conversations, that we on the local level have to make clear to the national church that this is what we stand for, and we expect you to speak out on this. And so that we also have a charge. We change. I always say that subjugating power trickles down, but real change radiates up. And so that we who sit in the pews, we on the local level, cannot let the national church get away with, we cannot have a general convention and not face these issues and act on them and make them a priority. So we have to say on the local level, nope, this is what we expect from the national church. And so that the national church can then say back, and this is what we expect then on the local level. If that makes sense.
And if I can just jump in here, I think that's so, as they say in Britain, spot on. And it really speaks to our governance structure in the church. And, we have these interim bodies of executive council who put forth resolutions, like our interim body, which is constituted of members from the provinces. So the resolutions that we're lifting up to the national level have come from the local level, in essence, because the people on the national body are from the local level. So we do have to, I think, encourage everyone to participate in this governance that we have, this governance structure that we have. We are a democracy, and our governance structure was built because we are in a democracy. So we all have to take the action to create that push, that impetus for the national level policies and positions to be stated, and also drive making sure that as we articulate from a national level what we expect, we're also providing tools and resources for the local level to take action.
Just one brief comment. I saw someone on the chat line, and I want to affirm this, that said we should, because our church is international, we should speak about the church-wide level. And so I want to affirm that.
Yes, yes, yeah, absolutely. And we have translation here going on as well. In Province 9, fully represented.
I don't like any boundaries, so I'm all right with that.
Yeah, exactly.
So does anybody want to speak about the financial resources that, and how, I don't even know how to ask a question on this. Because I think it was touched on earlier that certainly where we put our money is where we think is important. So how do we deal with this at the church-wide level with this budget issue?
So this is one of those questions that I brought up and we struggle with in ECCAR, particularly as when in the 2015 General Convention, there was $2 million set aside for to implement the racial reconciliation-oriented resolutions. And that money was then, and the resolutions dictated that the presiding officers would determine how to use those funds. The way that those funds were used were in creating the Becoming Beloved Community long-term commitment. We saw that the presiding officers introduced was April of last year and are rolling out now. So my question is, and I think I said this before, how do those funds get translated, used by local resources? Is there a need for the funds directly to be used through grants or applied through grants? And there are some grants from the church-wide, I'll say church-wide, making sure I'm including the international as well as the national. At the church-wide level, there are grant monies that can be used by local level dioceses and parishes. But beyond that, what's the percentage of the funds that we allocate for the presiding officers and the staff to do work versus that we apply at the provincial, diocesan, and parish level? What's the best governance that tells us what those percentages are? And I don't know that there's an answer for every topic.
Right.
But that's a question we're grappling with, especially if there's money allocated to do this kind of work. Where is that money being applied? How is it being divided? And is there an entity that decides how that gets divided? Or is it a catch as catch can in the very democratic fashion that we tend to operate? I don't have the answer to that, but I think that's a question we need to grapple with as we're trying to address this issue. So we do have the funding to go all around to put our budget where our mouth is, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Are there other questions from the chat? I think most of the ones that were sent in earlier have been spoken to.
Well, I captured a number that were early on, just after my presentation, so I can certainly share some thoughts on those, if you'd like.
Please.
So one question was around the definition of racial reconciliation. And I talked about how we want to have one definition that the church uses. We have come up with a definition that we've identified and put in our policy paper. So our policy is that everyone will use that one definition of racial reconciliation as we go forth to do this work. Another comment was about using the term dismantling racism instead of anti-racism. Potentially, and I know Joseph Brandt in his book used that term dismantling racism as well. A fabulous book. I call it the Bible. And the presiding officers have said that they want us to use the term racial reconciliation. So that's the term we're really pushing to use. And eliminating the sin of racism or dismantling racism, we think, is part of that work. Another question was to clarify, and I see the comment, the Bible is the Bible. Yes, you're correct. The Bible is the Bible. I get that point. Another question was to clarify how resolution 3 and 4 that we're putting forth work together. And so resolution 3 is all about the framework itself. It's legislatively, if you will, approving the framework that we are putting forth. Resolution 4 is about the implementation of that framework and making a statement that the church believes that everyone should be following the canons and the General Convention resolutions that have been put forth so far, and we recognize at the church level that they're not being followed, but they need to be. And how they need to be followed is by implementing and following the framework that has been defined in Resolution 3. So the two different resolutions, but they do work together to accomplish, hopefully, the goal of encouraging us to become a beloved community. So hopefully that helped with that question. I also was doing some poking around on the Episcopal Church website at the resolutions that have been posted so far. And a number of them I know have been just posted because I've been working with Marion Convoy on a couple of hours to officially get posted on the site. And I found that resolution A015 is being put forth, anti-racism training for interim bodies. So interim bodies being those bodies like ECCAR, which are brought forth per resolution, per General Convention resolution, and are only in existence for the term that the resolution states. So the resolution that's been put forth is that those bodies be included in the conviction that they go through anti-racism training. Another resolution that just came forth is A011, which is opposing environmental racism, put forth by the Advisory Committee on the Stewardship of Creation. So that's another resolution you'll probably see, and I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I know there's been a lot of talk about environmental racism and raising that up as part of the effort around stewardship creation. So that's what I have.
Can you define environmental racism? I'm not sure I understand that.
Sure. So environmental racism is the concept that policies around and legislation around how we deal with the environment have been having a negative impact either unconsciously or consciously to people of color. So if you think about policies and legislation that tries to clean up a community, that focuses on cleaning up a community or cleaning up a city, and where is that money actually spent to do that cleanup? Well, generally it's going to be spent to do with that cleanup in the more affluent areas rather than those areas where there are people of color who are predominantly there. So that's that concept of environmental racism.
Can I speak? I'm sorry.
Sure. Yes. Go ahead.
Yes, and environmental racism recognizes, for instance, that it's no accident that in Flint, Michigan, their water was contaminated because those are poor people and people of color. It's no accident that certain water filtration plants and garbage dumps are where they're located. Those are located where poor people and people of color live. And so environmental racism is about the way in which we treat the environments where people of color and poor people find themselves living and located, as well as the way in which we have neglected and not had stewardship of creation, how it disproportionately impacts people of color. But if you note, certain things are not placed in certain neighborhoods, and certain things are placed in certain neighborhoods. That's environmental racism.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Please, it says, please also share again or elaborate on ECCAR's definition of reconciliation.
Sure. So reconciliation, turning to be reconciled with one another and reconciled with God. So as opposed to anti-racism, which is fighting racism. Fighting racism is part of that. Fighting racism is what we need, just as, and there was a great discussion that Dr. Jennifer Harvey is leading and making around reparations. Reparations are a part of reconciliation, but they're not the be-all and end-all. We need to have a right relationship. We need to be reconciled with one another, have a right relationship with one another and with God. So that's the definition that we're using. And my theological friend, since I'm not ordained here, might be able to share some more about that.
No, you said right. And theologically, I mean, in general, we like to talk about is reconciliation is can we reconcile again? Can we meet again? And so can we come together again? And this is important, that again, the again after what?
Reconcile.
Right. Can we come together again or reconcile after we speak the truth of that which broke us apart? And after we go down into the pit that has separated us, deal with what's in that pit, can we come back together and meet again on the other side together? So reconciliation implies we have to not only tell the truth about what has separated us, that would be white supremacy in all of its forms, but also do the work, the justice that would allow us to be reconciled. So we can't reconcile without justice being done. And so that's what the beloved community is about. It's not simply about the cheap grace that we may call reconciliation, but it's asking that hard question. Can we come together again after telling the truth and doing the work of justice that can bring us together again?
And I would say, in addition to that, justice for what has happened in the past is a good part of it, but also this change of culture that we've been discussing so that it doesn't happen in the future, so that we don't have to reconcile in the future, although we know we'll have to constantly be reconciling ourselves with each other, but changing our institutions so that we don't get separated from each other again.
And those would be the lenses to use as you look at resolutions.
Yes.
Does this promote reconciliation? Does this offer ways of reconciling?
Absolutely.
May I add one about the budgetary discussion earlier? When you're looking at these resolutions and when you're kind of looking at monies that might go out to help in the congregations and the diocese and around the church versus staff members, I remember years ago, decades ago, when Jackie Means was the head of prison ministry for the Episcopal Church, and would come out of 815, and she came to this little town of Woodville where we had 1,500 inmates in a state prison, and brought the church with her, and opened up that prison in a way that I as a chaplain couldn't do, or as a way as a staff member couldn't do. And so that willingness to go out and speak on behalf of the church and have true leadership in those positions is very important, I think. I don't know about every position on every issue, but I do think it was wonderful and I'm sure that there are wonderful people working there now, but I just am old enough to remember that one better.
Okay, thank you.
I don't want to see that as a tension. You know, let's get rid of 815 and spend our money in a different way.
No.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. We've come to the end of our allotted time. I would like to, in the way of housekeeping, just remind people that some of this will all be recorded and posted, and everybody that signed up for this webinar will get a link to that so that you can go back and review some of these things. The next webinar is April 12th. It's a Thursday night also, and the area of interest is evangelism. I can't thank you three enough for being with us. I am so grateful that you took the time, James, Van, Kelly, to share with us your thoughts, ideas on this area of reconciliation, racial reconciliation. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Really, thank you very much.
And we thank the people that listened in on the webinar. I'm hoping that deputies found this helpful. And we'll see you next time, April 12th. So good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night. God bless.
I should